A lot going on. So much happening in this book. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we are going to be doing my June wrap-up. Alright, before we get to anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments how many books did you read in June? After having one of the most successful reading months in May, I unfortunately have had my lowest reading month so far in June. Yikes. That said, I do think my average page count per book I read was probably on the higher side because I did read a few chunky things this month, which is great. I'm trying to get over my fear of big books, so that's a solid one for me. But let's just go ahead and dive into the stats. As I said, I read 7 books this month, and across those 7 books, I read 3,918 pages. That does include converting audiobook hours 2 pages, but in regard to audiobook hours, I listened to almost 80 hours of audiobooks. That's a lot, actually. I can't believe that was that much. My average rating did come out to 3.71 stars, so not the best, but it could have been worse. Then for my genre stats, I read 3 books this month that were fantasies, 1 mystery, and 1 romantasy. Yes, I officially added that to my genre list because it might become a new thing. I don't know. We'll see. And then 2 sci-fi books. As for the little goals I keep for myself, I unfortunately didn't finish the nonfiction book I started this month. It's still sitting on my nightstand. I at least started reading one. I didn't read any comics or manga this month, unfortunately. And then I did obviously read a big book, as I was saying earlier. And then for my series stats, I did start into 1 new series. I continued 2, I finished 1, and then I decided that I will not be continuing with another. I'm gonna be lazy here, and we're just gonna talk about these books in the order that I read them. So starting at the top, the first book I finished this month was Flashfire by Klune. This kind of was a continuation from last month because I initially was hoping to read this for the end of Galactathon, but that did not happen. However, I wanted to continue this extraordinary series because the first book was so much fun. This was another silly fun time that also had some serious issues talked about in it. I just love this little family of characters that's been created here who do their best to work together and try to be heroes. I'm really impressed that this series has relied so much on communication, and the open line between the teenagers and the parents is just fantastic. I really appreciate that. As I said, there's some heavier topics going on here, everything that goes along with being queer, but then also there was some discussions around police brutality, what with Nick's father being a ex-police officer. On one hand, yes, those discussions were a little ham-fisted, but on the other hand, I appreciate the fact that Klune is trying to present these issues to younger readers so that they can start thinking about them themselves. And it plays well with the ongoing theme throughout the series of Nick learning how things aren't perfectly black and white, like comic books. It's not that simple. So I did appreciate the acknowledgement of that issue and the realism of it, as well as adding some levity from a lot of the silliness that goes on in this series, because it's very ridiculous at times. I will say I did notice a few continuity errors when it came to small details here and there. For example, Nick is severely tied to his phone because of his concern with his father working in a dangerous profession. And it's talked about in the first book, if he doesn't have his phone on him, he nearly has a panic attack. Whereas in this one, at one point, his phone gets destroyed and he barely acknowledges it. That was odd. I also think the fan fiction element, which was a lot of fun in the first book, where Nick writes fan fiction about the superhero that he's obsessed with, I was writing the line of a little too weird in this one just because of the events that took place in the first book. I like the acknowledgement of the fan fiction going on, but I don't know how I like it after everything that was revealed in the first book and then it continuing here. Even so, I will admit, it's still funny. I also just wanted a little bit more time with Nick and Seth actually getting to be alone as a couple. There's so much time in this book that is dedicated to the friend group, but now that they've finally established themselves as boyfriends, I thought we would get a little bit of time between them being really cute and sweet and that first love moment. Even still though, I had another fantastic time reading this one. I wasn't really sure what the big bad's goal was going to be at the end of this book, and there was a reveal that took place that I had conflicting feelings about. I'm currently in the middle of the 3rd book. I can say that I actually really like what the author ended up doing with that reveal, but I can't get into too many specifics yet. So in the end, my compile for this one came out to about 4 stars. Like I said, I did have a few issues, but still loving the series. Then next up, I read In the Ravenous by Strickland. This was my digital pick for my TBR jar this month, and I read it in my weekly reading vlog. I'll put a link to that in the cards. So this story is set in this fantastical world where there are these blood mages who have the ability to control blood. And in this specific country where our main character lives, they are paired with a ghost guardian who can control the blood mage to prevent them from becoming too powerful, from using their powers for their own gain rather than for the throne. They're basically always recruited to work for the royal family. However, our main character's father actually comes from a separate land where blood mages are the royalty themselves and they do not have these guardians. So she has always been taught to control her powers, hide them, try to prevent herself from being tied to one of these guardians. But at the start of the book, unfortunately, she ends up accidentally outing herself and is forced to work for the royal family, tied to a guardian, but is determined to try and get out from under this and stop the blight, this mysterious magical fog thing that is overtaking their country. And she is doing so by working sort of with her guardian, but also with the crown princess. And God, did I want to like this book, but no. Just like the hardest of no's. First off, this is sold as a poly romance, or at least I'll say this, by the time I DNF'd at 75% in, it still wasn't poly. The main character just has the hots for two separate people at the same time. And yet both of these possible relationships are insanely underdeveloped and really based on nothing apart from lust. And one of them is also with a 400-year-old ghost who, you know, can control her, in charge of her a lot of the time. And the power imbalance there felt so icky. It made me so uncomfortable anytime the feelings between these two was acknowledged. On the opposite side, the romance with the princess is there. Like I said, it feels like insta lust. I wasn't convinced by any actual feelings apart from the fact that they wanted to bang. Rowan, the main character, is also infuriating. For a lot of the book, I did feel like I could still root for her, which was what kept me reading, but everything else in the story really let this down. I already talked about the relationships, but the plot itself is insanely slow moving. And I was 75% in when it finally felt like we were getting some actual development there. And things went balls to the wall really quickly, but I almost immediately figured out where this was gonna go, and I just had no interest in reading that. The writing is overtly descriptive, which, yes, I do think added to the atmosphere, but also felt like the author was just trying to fill page time, which again, I don't think was needed when you took so long to do anything with the plot. There's a lot of world building going on at the beginning too, which I did like learning about. It didn't necessarily make a lot of sense when you think about it. I still didn't really understand like how the shadow magic worked or like how it played in with the blood magic. As I said, once I hit that point and figured out what was gonna happen, I really just stopped caring. So I DNF'd this one. Next up is the book that took me the longest time to read because I read it physically, and she is chunky. Strange and Stubborn Endurance by Foz and Meadows. That scared me. I'm so glad I finally got to read this. This was actually my 12 Recs by 12 Vamps from my friend Destiny, and I really enjoyed it. This is like a queer historical Regency fantasy romance in which we are following Velison, who is a queer man in a country where this is not necessarily illegal, but definitely frowned upon. At the start of this book, Velison returns home and is told by his lord father that he will be marrying a princess in the neighboring country of 𝗖cie in order to improve relationships between these two countries. Unfortunately, Velison is outed to his father as queer in a very traumatic way, and his father is furious, thinking this is going to ruin the arranged marriage, ruin this opportunity they have to align themselves with the neighboring country. But instead, the neighboring country is really cool and is like, oh, why didn't you tell us that you had a preference for men? We'll just marry you to the prince instead. So Velison ends up traveling to 𝗖cie and marrying 𝗖cie. However, shortly after arriving, somebody attempts to kill Velison in 𝗖cie's moniker's name. And the two of them end up relying on each other to try and figure out what is going on, to try and survive. There's a lot of politics at play in this story, and I really liked it. Meadows absolutely killed this in character creation and development. I cared about Velison so much. And I mean, this book starts with a punch. If you need trigger warnings, please check them out. I was completely engrossed in seeing Velison heal from the events he experiences. I will say this book happens in a very unrealistic timeline. The entirety of the story takes place across mostly a week. Velison travels to 𝗖cie and that takes about a week, but then the main events once he arrives there, it's like 5 days. And that kind of ties into my one issue with the book, which is pacing. It's a chunky book, so it was really odd because at times I would completely forget the fact that so little time had passed and yet so much had gone on in the story. As I said, there's the mystery, there's the politics that are taking place, but also a romance that's developing between 𝗖cie and 𝗖cie. All three of those things tied together very well in a way that made me never want to put this book down when I was reading it. I did wish that 𝗖cie had something similar to 𝗖cie in his background, in his side plot, to kind of allow for a little bit more exploration of his character, because it felt like, aside from the relationship and also like the events of the main plot, there wasn't really more to him. Though with how this book ends and knowing there's the second following the same characters, I'm curious to see if maybe their roles are reversed. I do think the two of them had a very strong dynamic, and a lot of their interactions were just so well done and made me thirsty for more. Again, the timeline, very unrealistic, but I could almost forgive it a lot of the time because they just felt like they flowed together so naturally. And they do go through a lot together in a few days, so it's understandable that they sort of trauma bond almost. I always enjoy seeing two enemies being forced to rely on each other for survival, and while these two aren't really enemies, it was interesting seeing it where, you know, they're husbands, but they also don't really know anything about each other. And I think that also kept me very engaged because I really enjoyed seeing them want to get to know each other and taking the time to understand one another, even while going through all this like crazy stuff. By the end, there were some very sweet and caring scenes. There's also a little bit of spice in this book that I did enjoy. The L-bomb is also dropped, and again, 5 days. Bit too much for me. But the impact, because of some of the really sweet things they say to each other and the actions they take for one another, did have me swooning. So like my logical brain can point out a lot of issues with this book. Enjoyment side is like, I don't even care. This was 4.5 stars. Already bought the second one. My God, why are my books all falling over? Next, I read The Boy in the Red Dress by Kristin Lambert. And this was kind of a random pickup because I needed a easy audiobook. Honestly, I'm shocked I haven't heard more people talk about this book on booktube because there's so many comparable titles that have been really popular in the past. So this is set in a queer speakeasy in the 1920s. At the beginning of this book, this affluent young woman ends up dying in the club, and she had previously been seen fighting with the main star of the club, Marion, who is a drag queen and is best friends with our main character. Millie believes that the cops are just going to go with the easiest answer, which is framing her friend for this death, even though she knows he is not responsible for it. So Millie takes it upon herself to figure out what took place that night. Again, I think this is a pretty solid YA mystery. It had great atmosphere, some queer rep going on. Millie is a bisexual woman, her aunt is a lesbian, Marion is a gay man who performs in drag. I don't know if I would necessarily say this is going to be like the most memorable mystery story, but I had a really good time reading it and I was very engaged the entire time. I really liked Millie. I liked her determination. I liked the way she stuck up for her friends. She's a little rough and tumble, and then, as I said, she is bisexual and there's a bi triangle in this. I actually really enjoyed how the author ended up resolving that, seeing as how I don't really tend to like love triangles. At the same time though, Millie is a little frustrating, but in the way of like, she is a teenager, so it kind of makes sense. And like I said, the atmosphere was pretty strong all the way through. I think the author did a good job with setting and using certain terms from the time period. I don't think it's necessarily like The Diviners by loveyoubye, because that is absolutely 10 out of 10 in that series, but still, I felt like I was transported into the time period every time I was reading the book. Plus, with having a strong main character like Millie, it is easy to get invested into the story. As for the mystery itself, I think the author did a good job. There were little clues throughout that I could follow. I didn't put it together early, but I did figure it out right around the same time Millie did. And there are actually a few scenes that pull you to the edge of your seat, make you a little anxious for Millie as she gets more and more into the thick of things. I thought the final reveal was well done. Honestly, across the board, this was pretty enjoyable. Again, I'm shocked that I haven't seen other people really ever talk about it, but it came out to a 4 stars on my cop pile. Definitely an easy, fun read. Next, for the series that I finished, I completed the Between Earth and Sky series with Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse, which I had been highly anticipating. So this series is based in pre-Columbian America, and we follow two separate sides of the city. There's the council that leads the city and is headed by the Sun Priest, but then we also follow 𝗖cie, this mysterious young man who is a member of Carrion Crow, a more marginalized group of Tova, and he is being taken there by this pirate captain 𝗖cie in the first book. I can't believe it's actually over here. I'm so sad to say goodbye to some of the characters in this series. Another book where the author absolutely excels in character creation, in exploration of trauma, and the development of the relationships in the story. Just so good. That's something I absolutely adored about this series, is the characters. I became so attached to 𝗖cie and 𝗖cie in particular, if I'm being honest. They just kept me engaged the entire time through the series, but also in this book, I was desperate for the two of them to see each other. That said, even characters that I didn't like or I felt very meh on in the earlier books really had grown on me by this point, and so I liked following their stories as well. For example, Aoki, who is another person involved in Carrion Crow, he really struggles in his loyalties, the weight on his shoulders that he is trying to accomplish everything for his family, for the people of his clan, but also how those don't always align with his own morals. I actually really liked the relationship between he and 𝗖cie in this book, and the bonding they have over forming their own identity apart from the destiny that's been laid out. Then I also enjoyed seeing more of 𝗖cie, who I really struggled with in the earlier books, but by this point, I gotta admit, your actions really endeared me. Your determination and the reflection they go through in this book is really 10 out of 10, and finally allowed me to become a lot more emotionally invested in Jim. There was also more exploration of a certain character that we've known from the beginning, but really haven't seen much of his background or his motivations, and I loved the exploration Roanhorse did with him in particular. I thought it made it very interesting, made him a very convincing role. I'm trying to be ambiguous on purpose, because at the start of the series, things are very gray in what they're trying to accomplish and who is good and who is bad. Who should you actually be rooting for? The atmosphere and world building in the series has been impeccable. Same thing here. I was absolutely transported to the story. I loved seeing more of the 𝗖cie, which are, think like a siren, and 𝗖cie is one of them. I really enjoyed learning about their way of life. And then also on the opposite side, I was fascinated by the God's Graveyard, which is a setting that one of our characters has been staying in during the events in this book. But with both of them, I will admit I was a little disappointed that we didn't have more time to learn about these places. There'd been a lot of nods and hints to things for both of these places in the earlier books, so the fact that we had such limited time now that we were finally there kind of bummed me out, which unfortunately ties into one of my biggest criticisms of this book, and that's the pacing. It is nearing 600 pages and it does feel it. There's a lot of buildup here because I actually did want more of like the setting and these places. I almost feel like this should have been a 4-book series, and we should have had certain events take place in both of those places that kind of amped up the excitement, and then, you know, the closeout of everything going on here. Like I said, there's so much going on in this story. There are many characters you follow, and there's so much time for each of them. There's so much development for each of them. I wouldn't want to lose any of that time that we got with those characters, but I feel like I needed a little bit more. Then for the climax, like again, there's so much buildup that I was really expecting this blowout. While Roanhorse did surprise me with what she ended up doing, I don't necessarily know if it made the climax as satisfying as I was hoping for. In the end, I liked this, I really did. I do think it's a solid ending. I just don't necessarily know if it's like the perfect ending with how things close out for the characters. Love. There's one aspect of the story that's kind of open-ended, and I'm wondering if perhaps Roanhorse left that opportunity to write more in this universe. I would love that. I would love to return to this universe. This came out to 4 stars. Not perfect, but good enough, and I'm glad I finally got to see the end for these characters. And then lastly, the other random book that I ended up picking up, Light from Uncommon Stars by Ryka Aoki. This was a gift from my cousin last Christmas, so I had heard of it, but never really had enough interest to pick it up. However, when she bought it for me, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm intrigued. Let's try this out. This is a weird book. There's a lot going on. So we start out following Shizuka, who is a demon that has been making bargains for violin players' souls so that they will achieve success. And she has done this with 6 different souls thus far and is looking for her 7th. She ends up meeting Katrina, who is a runaway trans girl who unfortunately is going through it at the beginning of the story. Basically opens up her home to Katrina, but also planning to eventually make this Faustian bargain with her. At the same time, we also follow Lan, who is an alien and has become a refugee on Earth with her family, running this donut shop, but the giant donut on top of the building is actually their spaceship. There's actually something that's not even mentioned on the back, but I would argue is like another relatively important character, is Lucy, a woman who owns this violin repair shop that has passed down through the male side of her family and is still struggling with the fact that she is the one in charge of this, even though her family never wanted her to. And she is also hoping to start training her son to eventually take it on himself. A lot going on. So much happening in this book. There are so many directions in the plot. Honestly, I really liked this though, and once again, I do think it comes down to the characters. The character growth, the found family, the cozy vibes are all there, and for me at least, all perfect. But like, the plot is a roller coaster. It had a few holes, if I'm being honest. It had some unresolved issues. There's one part of the story that like never came up again. There's a few conveniences, but again, all in all, I didn't even really care that much because Aoki had made me care so much about Katrina, about Shizuka, about Lan, about Lucy. Were these the most well-written relationships I'd ever read about? No, but the author endeared me to each of these characters so much that I really cared about them, and I cared about their happiness. The vibes were just vibing here, and I was sold on it. I honestly think this is like a sci-fi book for Erin Morgenstern fans because her books are all about vibes and characters. Like, the plots are so soft, and that is kind of how this felt. Just because of the holes and the unresolved issues, I only gave it 4 stars, but I really liked this. It's one of those where like I can see the issues, but a lot of the time I didn't even really care. All right, and on that note, that is it for today, y'all. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, let's leave a donut emoji in the comments. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me, linked in the description. I come out videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!